My son and his wife planned to sell my ancestral land to pay their debts. They called it just a dusty old plot. They brought me the papers, smiling, thinking their frail mother would sign her legacy away. They didn't know that years ago I'd already made that land legally untouchable. They thought they were selling a field. They were trying to sell a fortress. My story begins not with a bang, but with the quiet settling of dust. It is a true story from the sun-drenched soil of California. After my husband James passed, the world seemed to shrink until it was only me and the land. 100 acres of golden hills and gnarled oaks that had belonged to the Warren family for 5 generations. James and I had made a promise to his father and to each other that this land would remain a testament to our name, a living library of our history. I spent the first 2 years of my widowhood honoring that promise. My hands, though wrinkled and spotted with age, knew the language of this place. I was the foundation. I planted cypress saplings along the western fence line, just as James had always planned. I tended the rose garden his mother had cultivated, its roots as deep and tangled as our own family tree. Each day was a ritual of remembrance. The scent of dry earth after a rare rain, the scratch of rake tines against packed dirt, the weight of a wicker basket filled with tomatoes from the vine. These were my companions. The house itself was a museum of our life together. His armchair in the living room still held the faint impression of his form. Our wedding portrait hung in the hall, our younger faces full of a certainty that only time could test. I was not lonely. I was occupied. I was the keeper of memories, the guardian of a legacy written not in ink, but in soil and stone. But time is a patient thief. It began to steal the strength from my bones, the steadiness from my hands. A fall while pruning the wisteria left me with a hip that ached with every change in the weather, a dull, constant reminder of my own fragility. It was then that my son, Ryan, and his wife, Melissa, insisted I move in with them. Their house was modern, all clean lines and cool, impersonal surfaces. It felt a world away from the warmth and history of my home, a place of glass and steel that had no soul. "It's for the best, Mom," Ryan said, his voice gentle but firm, the same tone he used when he was a boy, trying to convince me he hadn't broken a window. "We can't have you out there all alone. It's not safe." I packed a single suitcase, leaving a life's worth of belongings behind, believing it was temporary. I thought they were acting out of love, out of a sense of duty. I went from homeowner to guest, from matriarch to dependent, trusting that they saw me as their mother, Eleanor, not as a burden. It was a mistake I would come to understand with painful, chilling clarity. I left my home, the land, my entire world, and walked into theirs. I became a ghost, carrying the scent of mothballs and a history they had no interest in reading. They had no idea I had heard them, and that was the one thing that kept me alive. My son kept eating head down, not a word. They thought I was just an old woman with nowhere to go. They thought wrong. It's like living with a shadow. She's just always there. This house feels like a coffin with her in it. Kindness breeds entitlement. So I erased that kindness. I was a background character in a story that had long since erased my name from the script. This is not a story. This is a life, and I'm still living it. I didn't lose a son. I lost the illusion that he ever really saw me. They laughed when I packed, but they cried when they saw who owned the deed. They wanted me gone. I took the roof instead. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. My silence was the loudest message I could send. Paper doesn't forget. Silence might protect peace, but truth defends dignity. Motherhood is not a contract for endless forgiveness. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but this is not revenge. It's restoration. I was never a parasite. I was the foundation. And when I left, the whole house fell. The first few months in Ryan and Melissa's house were a blur of careful adjustments. I tried to make myself small to fit into the cracks of their established life. My room was the guest room, a space with no personality, a blank canvas that stubbornly refused to accept any color I tried to add. The few things I brought with me, a framed photo of James, a hand-stitched quilt, seemed out of place against the sterile gray walls, like artifacts from a forgotten civilization. I went from being the foundation of a home to being a piece of furniture, something to be dusted around and occasionally acknowledged. I had become a tolerated ghost in my own son's house. Melissa especially treated me with a kind of brittle politeness that felt colder than any insult. Her judgments came in cold glances and clenched lips. She would smile, but it never reached her eyes. "Eleanor, can I get you anything?" She'd ask, her voice like sugar-coated contempt, her tone suggesting that any request would be an imposition. Meals were the hardest. At my own table, I had presided over decades of family dinners, the kitchen a place of warmth and nurturing. Here I sat silently at the end of their gleaming quartz island, a cold, hard barrier between us. They often served me a different, simpler meal on a chipped plate I soon recognized as mine. I was being erased not with the loud cruelty neighbors might hear, but with these quiet, deliberate shifts. I was a leech, a parasite, dead weight. Ryan, my son, seemed to shrink in his own home. He avoided my gaze, his conversations with me becoming brief and superficial. The man who had once run to me with scraped knees and boyhood secrets now spoke of weather and traffic, his eyes darting towards Melissa as if for approval. I saw the shame in him, a quiet, flickering thing, but he lacked the strength to act on it. He had his father's eyes, but none of his fire. His sin was inaction and silence. The cruelty wasn't in loud arguments, but in these quiet omissions. They would make plans for the weekend in front of me, discussing dinner reservations and outings as if I were invisible, as if I were wallpaper. It's like living with a shadow. She's just always there. I spent my days looking out the window, my gaze fixed on the distant hills of my own property, a place that felt more like home than the bed I slept in. I didn't complain. I said nothing. I simply observed, and in my silence I began to build a ledger of wrongs, noting every cold glance, every dismissive sigh, every conversation that stopped the moment I entered a room. I was quiet, but quiet does not mean blind. They mistook my silence for surrender. It was a mistake. They thought my silence meant I was weak, that I had accepted my demotion from mother to maid. They forgot that I was a court secretary for 47 years. I knew how to watch, how to listen, and how to document. My memory was my sharpest weapon, and I was honing it with every passing day. Love without respect is not love at all. And I was beginning to understand that the love I had for the man my son had become was fading, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. This was not a home. It was a waiting room, and I was simply waiting for the right moment to remember everything for them. They were so busy seeing me as a burden, they never stopped to consider that I might still be the one holding everything together. The politeness, thin as it was, began to fray. I could feel the tension in the house coiling like a snake, a low hum of anxiety that settled in the walls. It was in the sharp, clipped tones Melissa used on the phone when discussing bills, her voice a weapon against some unseen creditor. It was in the way Ryan's shoulders were permanently hunched towards his laptop, as if he were trying to physically shield himself from the numbers on the screen. There was a scent of bleach and secrets that seemed to linger in the air, a desperate attempt to scrub away a stain that was spreading from within. Their financial troubles were a specter haunting the hallways, and I was beginning to understand that they saw me not as family, but as a feature of their problem. I had become a background character in a story that had long since erased my name from the script. The true turning point, the moment the veil was torn away, completely came on a Tuesday night. It was the final straw. I had woken up my old hip aching and made my way to the kitchen for a glass of water, the cold tiles beneath my feet a shock to the system. The lights were off, but I could hear their voices low and conspiratorial, drifting from the living room. I froze in the shadows of the hallway, my hand clutching the cold wall for support. It's the only way Ryan... Melissa's voice was a sharp hiss cutting through the darkness. That land is just sitting there, just wasted space. Think of what that money could do for us. We could wipe out the credit cards, the car loan, everything. There was a pause, and I held my breath, a silent prayer forming in my heart. I prayed for my son to defend our family's legacy, to remember the man who gave him his name. But his response was weak, a pathetic murmur of defeat. I don't know, Melissa. It's Mom's. She laughed, a sound completely devoid of warmth, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, please. It's just a dusty old plot that no one would miss. She's in no condition to manage it. We'd be doing her a favor, really. It's a liability. A liability. The land my husband had poured his life into. The soil I had tilled with my own hands. The view that had been the first thing I saw every morning for 50 years. They spoke of it as if it were a pile of trash to be discarded, a meaningless asset on a balance sheet. They never once considered asking me. They didn't care about the promise, the history, or the soul of the place. They saw only dollar signs, a quick fix for the life they couldn't afford. They saw me as an obstacle to be managed, an old woman with a fading mind who could be easily manipulated. I stood there in the darkness, the glass in my hand forgotten, and I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't heartbreak. That had been a slow, creeping process over months. This was different. Something snapped. It was the cold, hard shock of clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you realize the people you love are strangers. It was not revenge that was born in that moment. It was reality. A reality they had chosen. I didn't retreat to my room and cry. I had cried enough in this cold, sterile house. The shock had built a wall inside me, and behind that wall, a calm certainty was rising like the wind before a storm. I stood in the darkness, listening to them plot the desecration of my husband's memory, and the woman who had felt like a ghost began to solidify. The Eleanor Warren who had been a court secretary for 47 years, who had managed household accounts down to the penny, who had raised a son and buried a husband, was reawakening. They mistook my silence for surrender. It was a mistake. They had mistaken my quiet grief for senility, my silence for submission. They saw an old woman with nowhere else to go, a piece of furniture to be moved around their lives. They had forgotten who I was. I returned to my room and sat in the single armchair by the window, the moonlight casting long shadows on the floor. I didn't think about their betrayal. I thought about the land. I remembered a conversation with James years ago after a developer had offered to buy the northern pasture. "This land tells our story, Eleanor," he had said, his hand resting on a weathered fence post. "We're just its caretakers. We have to make sure the story doesn't end with us." After he died, those words became my mission. And in that moment, sitting in that sterile guest room, I remembered the steps I had taken to fulfill that mission. It wasn't just a memory, it was a weapon. It was the forgotten document. They thought the land was a dusty, forgotten plot, a liability. They had no idea that I had spent the first year of my widowhood doing more than just planting trees. I had been busy with paperwork. I had been making calls to lawyers, filing applications with the state, and attending long, tedious meetings with men in suits. They saw an asset to be liquidated. I had ensured it was a legacy to be preserved forever. A quiet smile touched my lips for the first time in months. It was a smile they would never understand. They were whispering about selling something that could not be sold. They were planning to profit from a history they had no claim to, a history they had actively tried to erase. It was not my heart that was broken anymore. It was their foolish, greedy plan. I slept soundly that night, more soundly than I had since the day I moved into their house. For the first time, I was not a victim. I was a matriarch with a secret. I was the foundation they had tried to build upon without checking if it was solid. And I knew with an absolute, unshakable certainty that this was not a story about loss. It was a story about restoration. It was a story about a quiet legal reckoning. Paper doesn't forget, and my proof was waiting silent and patient for its moment to speak. The truth doesn't shout. It survives. And I had the truth on paper tucked away, waiting for them. The next morning I began my quiet work. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers over a telephone line. While Melissa was at her yoga class stretching her body while her character atrophied, and Ryan was locked in his home office staring at spreadsheets, I made a phone call. I spoke to a man named Mr. Walter Benedetti, the head of the California Heritage Trust. He was an old acquaintance, a professional ally, a man who understood that the value of history couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. "Eleanor," he said, his voice warm and professional, a comforting sound of competence. "It's good to hear from you. Is everything all right with the Warren estate?" My voice was calm and measured as I explained the situation. I omitted the emotional details of the whispers in the dark, the chipped plate, the slow and steady erasure of my own existence. I focused only on the facts. I told him there was a potential threat to the integrity of the protected site. "I see," he said, and I could hear the faint, decisive sound of keyboard clicks. "Well, let me reassure you. The Warren ancestral land was granted permanent protected heritage status 3 years ago. The documentation is ironclad. It cannot be sold, subdivided, or developed. The restrictions are legally binding and irreversible." He promised to send me an updated copy of the official certificate and a summary of the legal protections, just for my peace of mind. I gave him the address to a post office box I had maintained for years, a small anchor of independence they knew nothing about. For the next few weeks, I became the perfect picture of a docile, fading old woman. I ate the simple meals Melissa prepared for me without comment. I simply started collecting the dishes. That was how I responded. I nodded politely during Ryan's brief, stilted conversations. I sat in my chair by the window, my hands folded in my lap. But I was not idle. I was a quiet, observing protagonist. I was a general watching the enemy's movements from a fortified position. My silence was no longer born of sadness. It was strategic. I watched as they became more confident, their whispers replaced by more open discussions about a windfall that was coming their way. They started looking at new cars online. Melissa bought a ridiculously expensive handbag, a monument to her own entitlement. They were spending money they didn't have, counting on a treasure that was locked in a vault they couldn't see. They saw me as a passive obstacle, a signature they would eventually have to obtain. They had no idea that I was the fortress itself, and the walls were impenetrable. My silence was the loudest message I could send, but they were too deafened by their own greed to hear it. I was waiting patiently for the moment they would ask me to sign my name, and I would instead show them my power. A week later, a thick manila envelope arrived at my P.O. box. The forgotten document. Inside, on heavy watermarked paper, was the official certificate from the Heritage Trust. The language was dense and legal, a fortress of words like easement, in perpetuity, and irrevocable. The meaning, however, was crystal clear. It detailed every restriction, every clause, every legal barrier that stood between my family's land and their greed. I read it over and over, not for reassurance, but to arm myself with the precise language of my victory. Paper doesn't forget. It holds the truth in bold black ink, a silent witness that cannot be swayed by false smiles or desperate pleas. It was the truth on paper that they had chosen to ignore. I slipped the document into the bottom of my suitcase beneath the quilt my grandmother had made. It was a piece of my history protecting another. The atmosphere in the house shifted again. A syrupy, artificial kindness began to flow in my direction. Kindness breeds entitlement. Melissa started making my favorite lemon tea, leaving it on my nightstand in the morning. Ryan began asking about my day, his questions dripping with a false sincerity that was almost suffocating. They were lambs preparing the slaughter of what they thought was their inheritance. They were circling, getting ready to move in for the final fatal blow. "Mom, we were thinking," Ryan began one evening, his arm draped awkwardly around Melissa's shoulder, as they stood in my doorway, a portrait of manufactured affection. "We found a wonderful realtor, a real professional. He thinks he can get a fantastic price for the old property. It would be enough to finally give you the peace of mind you deserve." I simply nodded my expression, placid a mask of benign confusion. "That's nice, dear," I said, my voice betraying nothing. I let them build their castle in the sky. I let them dream of their debts vanishing, of the lifestyle they felt they deserved. I let them believe they were in control. Every cloying, "How are you feeling, Eleanor?" and every forced smile was another brick in the wall of their own delusion. They were so busy planning their future that they had completely forgotten to check the past. They saw me as the final easy step in their plan, a forgetful old woman who would sign anything put in front of her. They had no idea that I wasn't a step. I was the end of the road. The quiet satisfaction I felt was not vengeful. It was not revenge. It was reality. It was the calm of knowing that justice, like a well-tended garden, sometimes takes time to bloom. And the harvest was coming. My silence was not weakness. It was the quiet before the storm, a storm that would wash away their lies and leave only the hard, unshakable truth. They had written me out of their story, but I was about to write the final chapter. The day they chose for their final performance was a sunny Thursday. The stage was set. They had created an atmosphere of manufactured celebration, with Melissa even baking a lemon cake, a gesture so transparent it was almost comical. The kitchen, a space of my former humiliation, was now the theater for their grand deception. They sat me down at the dining room table, a place I was usually excluded from, and poured me a cup of tea in one of their good cups, not my usual chipped mug. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy with unspoken greed. Ryan cleared his throat, placing a sleek leather portfolio on the table. He and Melissa exchanged a look, a small, triumphant smile passing between them. "Mom," he began, his voice smooth and rehearsed, like a salesman closing a deal. "We have some wonderful news. We've received a phenomenal offer for the land. It's more than we ever expected. It's enough to set us all up for the future, to ensure you have the best care." Melissa chimed in, her voice like sugar-coated contempt. "All we need is your signature on a few simple papers. It's just a formality, really, to transfer the title." They pushed the portfolio towards me. I didn't open it. I let their words hang in the air, a monument to their greed. I looked at my son, at the man he had become, a stranger wearing a familiar face. I didn't lose a son. I lost the illusion that he ever really saw me. I saw the weakness in his eyes, the way he deferred to his wife's stronger will. I felt a pang of sorrow, not for me, but for the boy I had raised who was now lost. I let the silence stretch. I enjoyed the slight flicker of uncertainty that began to cross their faces. They expected me to be grateful, or perhaps confused and easily led. They were not prepared for what came next. My hands didn't tremble as I reached for my worn leather handbag that sat on the chair beside me. I didn't cry. I didn't say a word. I simply unclasped it, the click sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. They watched me, their smiles tightening at the edges, a thread of unease beginning to weave through their confidence. They thought this was their moment of triumph. They were wrong. This was mine. I was about to remind them that I was never a parasite. I was the foundation, and I was about to show them just how solid that foundation was. From my handbag, I withdrew the manila envelope from the Heritage Trust, the forgotten document. It was not as sleek as their leather portfolio. It was plain official and heavy with consequence. I placed it on the table directly beside their pristine sales documents. The contrast was stark, their flimsy future versus my solid past. Ryan and Melissa stared at the envelope, their brows furrowing in confusion. "What's this, Mom?" Ryan asked, his practiced calm beginning to crack his voice a half step higher than usual. "Just some paperwork of my own," I replied, my voice even and steady. I slowly, deliberately pulled the certificate from the envelope. The pace was a controlled crescendo. I unfolded the heavy paper and smoothed it out on the table. The official seal of the state of California and the bold typed words at the top were impossible to miss. Certificate of Permanent Protected Heritage Site. I watched their faces as they read the words. It happened in slow motion. The sentences were short and staccato now. Melissa's practiced smile vanished, replaced by a mask of disbelief. The color drained from Ryan's face, leaving him looking pale and sick. His eyes darted from the paper to my face and back again, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. What is this?" Melissa stammered, her voice losing its sugary coating and turning sharp and brittle. "This is a joke, right?" "Paper doesn't joke, Melissa," I said quietly. My voice was low, but it filled the room. "And it doesn't forget. That land has been a protected heritage site for 3 years. It cannot be sold. It cannot be developed. It cannot be touched." I saw the flicker of hope in Ryan's eyes, that this was some bluff, some misunderstanding, born of an old woman's confusion. He was still clinging to the idea that I was weak. So I reached into my handbag again, took out my mobile phone, and placed a call. The all rise moment had arrived. I tapped the speaker button, and the clear, authoritative voice of Mr. Walter Benedetti filled the silent room. "Eleanor, how can I help you?" he asked. The trap was set. Now it was time to spring it. The quiet legal reckoning was about to be delivered not by me, but by the dispassionate voice of the law itself. Justice doesn't shout. It speaks clearly, calmly, and with irrefutable authority. Their laughter had ended. Now they would cry when they saw who owned the deed, or in this case, who had protected it beyond their reach. "Walter." I said, my voice steady, while my son and daughter-in-law sat frozen in horror. This was the inverted confrontation. "I have my son Ryan and his wife Melissa here with me. They have some questions about the legal status of the Warren ancestral land." There was a brief professional pause on the other end of the line. "Of course." Mr. Benedetti's voice came through crisp and undeniable. "As we discussed, the Warren property is under a permanent legally binding heritage easement filed and recorded with the state of California. To be clear, any attempt to sell, subdivide, or alter the protected land is legally impossible. The designation is in perpetuity. It is for all intents and purposes untouchable. Is there anything else I can clarify?" The silence that followed his words was absolute, heavier than any scream. Melissa stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. Ryan had his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The reality of their situation, the totality of their failure, was crashing down on them. Their comfortable reality was shattered by the arrival of a legal fact. "Thank you, Walter. That's all," I said, and ended the call. Melissa was the first to break. The matriarch never loses her composure. The antagonists do. "You did this! You went behind our backs!" She shrieked, her voice shrill with rage and panic. "You knew, you sat there and let us believe." Ryan looked up at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading shame. His regret was rooted in consequence, not remorse. "Mom, why we're drowning in debt? This was our only way out." I looked at them, not with anger, but with a profound and weary sadness. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My quiet words carried more weight than their hysterics ever could. This was my final calm statement. "Your debts are your own. You don't get to pay for your mistakes by selling our family's soul," I said. "This land is not a line of credit. It's a legacy. Some things are worth more than money, Ryan. They are worth our family's name." I stood up from the table, leaving their useless sales contract and my irrefutable certificate lying side by side. The proof on the table. I didn't look back at their shattered faces or listen to their frantic, useless protests. I simply walked to my room, packed my single suitcase, and left the house where I had been a guest. I didn't lose a home. I reclaimed a world. This was not revenge. It was restoration. I walked away, leaving them to the mess they had created, a mess built on a foundation of disrespect and greed. The foundation I had built was strong, and it had just protected itself. I now live in a small cottage on a rented plot of land just a few miles from the Warren estate. From my porch, I can see the familiar silhouette of the oak trees on the ridgeline, standing like sentinels guarding our history. The air here is clean, and the silence is a comfort, not a punishment. It is not grand, but it is mine. The peace is mine. Ryan and Melissa were left to drown in the consequences of their choices. Their mountain of debt remained, and without the easy solution they had counted on, their comfortable life began to crumble. But their financial ruin was nothing compared to the shame they now carry, a weight far heavier than any loan. They didn't just lose a windfall, they lost their integrity. I didn't do it for revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy fire that consumes everything. What I sought was preservation. It was not about punishing them, but about protecting what James and I had built, what generations before us had cherished. It was about honoring a promise. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but this is not revenge. It's restoration. I tell this story not to gloat, but because it needs to be told. This story is not just mine. It belongs to every mother and father who has been told they are in the way. To the women and men who have been made to feel like relics in your own lives, whose history is dismissed as dusty old plots. Hear this. Your memories have weight. Your legacy has value. And your silence does not mean you are powerless. Your worth does not expire with age. Sometimes the quietest actions create the most profound results. Do not let them turn you into a stranger in the house you helped build. Keep your name on the deed. Keep your name on your dignity. Keep your hands on your history. Because love without respect is not love at all. And a family that forgets its past has no future worth saving. You are not just a chapter in their story. You are the author of your own. I didn't lose a home. I reclaimed a world. And if you're listening to this, know this: you are not alone, and you are not done. Thank you for listening to this story. If it stirred something inside you, if you have ever felt like your voice was being silenced, then I invite you to do one simple thing. Subscribe to Her Quiet Revenge True Stories and hit the notification bell. Because here, every mother has a voice, every sacrifice gets remembered, and every quiet act of dignity matters. You are not alone. We'll be back with another story soon.